staying with legal matters, the Constitutional Court will today deliver judgment in the matter of Janus Walus, the Justice Department, the Hani family and the SACP. Walus assassinated SACP General Secretary Chris Hani in April 1993. Walus has approached the Apex Court to ask it to review and overturn Minister Ronald Lamola's refusal to grant him parole. Walus's lawyers argued that the minister's decision was unlawful and discriminatory. This is Walus's fifth attempt to get parole since his first application in 2011. Earlier, advocate Muzi Sikakane, who represented the Hani family and the SACP, argued against Walus's release on parole, saying he murdered both an individual and a democratic dream. Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined by Ulrich Roux. He's the founder of Ulrich Roux and Associates. He joins us now. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, what are the implications or the practical implications of the latest SCA decision upholding the High Court's decision that the parole, that is the medical parole decision, was unlawful? Is there a chance that former President Jacob Zuma will have to return to jail?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Yes, well, that is the direct implication of the SCA's ruling today, is that the decision to have granted him medical parole and for him to be released on medical parole was an irrational decision and an unlawful decision, and that it should never have been made, and that accordingly he should return to the Department of Correctional Services to serve the remainder of his sentence. But just to bring the viewers up to speed again as to what transpired prior to this. Remember that Jacob Zuma refused to testify at the State Capture Inquiry Commission, or better known as the Zondo Commission. He was then held to be in contempt of a constitutional court order which forced him to testify there, and accordingly he was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment. After serving 2 months of that sentence, he was released on medical parole, following a decision made at the time by the Commissioner of Correctional Services, Mr. Arthur Fraser. And the court found that his decision was an irrational one, given that Jacob Zuma's application to be released on medical parole was set aside by the Medical Parole Board, which is an appointed board, advisory board, which is an appointed board which determines whether a person should be released on medical parole or not. So Arthur Fraser went over the head, so to speak, of that parole advisory board and made a decision to release Jacob Zuma on medical parole. And the SCA, which is the Supreme Court of Appeal, has now found that that was the incorrect decision made by Arthur Fraser. And accordingly, Mr. Zuma should serve the remainder of his sentence.
Thank you very much for that background. I think it is very helpful to the viewers indeed. And we'll touch on the Arthur Fraser issue in a moment. But given what you've told us about the Constitutional Court actually being the one imposing the sentence on President Zuma because he was held in contempt of court for refusing to attend those state capture inquiry hearings, do you think, what are the chances, should he decide to appeal, what are the chances that they would find in his favor?
I think that should he elect to approach the Constitutional Court, which he most likely will. I mean, we've all seen Jacob Zuma's use of the judicial system. They would refuse his access to the Constitutional Court, and they would accordingly dismiss his application to the court. The court has already considered his matter and found him to be in contempt of a Constitutional Court order, accordingly sentencing him to 15 months imprisonment. So I think that should he take the decision of the Supreme Court of Appeal on appeal to the Constitutional Court, he would most likely not succeed in such an application.
So coming to the issue of Arthur Fraser basically going over the heads of his peers and in that medical parole board that you described to us, are there any repercussions for him, do you think?
Well, the difficulty with that is that he made that decision to release Jacob Zuma on parole a mere few days before his term came to an end as the Commissioner of the Department of Correctional Services. So certainly he won't be receiving any sanctions pertaining to his position and his employment. But one could expect possibly the Democratic Alliance, the Helen Suzman Foundation and the other parties linked to this application to consider launching an action for damages against Mr. Arthur Fraser to recover all of the costs that they've incurred in having to bring these applications and having to approach the court for the relief that they've sought, because it was ultimately the decision of Arthur Fraser which led to the numerous court applications which followed Jacob Zuma's release on medical parole.
Yeah.
So not in his capacity as an employee of the department, but certainly his personal capacity, he could face action for the recovery of those damages.
So one last thing, of course, we're just less than an hour ahead of that decision by the Constitutional Court on the Janus Walus case, or Wunish case. He's looking to ensure that he gets parole. It's something that's been refused to him on several occasions. Ronald Lamola refused him parole in March 2020. How do you think the Constitutional Court is going to deal with this one?
Well, it's always a difficult prediction to make, of course. One needs to look at the considerations that the parole board need to take into consideration when they decide whether a person qualifies to be released on parole or not. And one of the most important aspects to consider is the effect that the crime which the person who was sentenced to imprisonment committed, and the effect that that crime had on the family members and society. In this instance, the family members of the late Chris Hani, and obviously the devastating effects of his murder and the implications thereof on the family members, but as well as on society. Our country was, of course, in a very delicate political position at the time, and Chris Hani's murder certainly sent shockwaves not only through our country but the rest of the world as well, and these are very important considerations which need to be taken into account. It is his 5th application for parole already. To my knowledge, the family is steadfast in that he should not be released on parole, that he has not been rehabilitated properly, that his heinous act of murdering Chris Hani can never be forgiven by them, and also by the democratic South Africa, and these are certainly considerations which the Constitutional Court would have to take into account. A difficult decision, to say the least. That together with the other factors such as reports on how he behaved whilst incarcerated, whether to the Department of Correctional Services and to their knowledge he has rehabilitated himself, has he actively taken part in rehabilitative programs such as anger management, etc., etc. And one would have to wait and see whether the Constitutional Court, when weighing up all of those factors, finds that he is a person who has been rehabilitated and who qualifies to be released on parole. It's a difficult one to make a prediction on, but I would say that it's 50-50 at this stage.
All right. Well, we'll wait to hear what the Constitutional Court has to say at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much for your time there. That was Ulrich Roux. He's a legal expert.